Good morning, everybody. I'm Inga Paus, and I'm running the Vodafone Institute together with a great team here in Berlin. And actually, some of you might have already had the opportunity to join us for a physical AI&I event in Berlin, which we launched in 2018 to discuss the impact of artificial intelligence on our society and economy. And in fact, tomorrow, actually, we wanted to host Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister here in Berlin at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the International Club. But then COVID got in our way. And after canceling the event, we got the idea, why don't we do it virtually? Because Audrey, actually, who is better prepared actually to do this types of events in a virtual way than Audrey Tang, who is a renowned global thought leader and practice leader when it comes to digital democracy and e-government. So we were super happy that she spontaneously accepted our invitation to run the premiere of AI&I vTalk with us. And here we go. So I will hand it over now to our host, whom many of you know. It's Alexander Görlach. He's joining us from New York and got up in the middle of the night to run you through some interesting questions and an interview with Audrey here. Alex, you might know that, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where he works on democracy in the digital age. So it's a good coincidence. Prior to that, he served in various positions at the Harvard University, and he is also an expert on Taiwan because 2 years ago he spent a year at the university in Taipei as a visiting scholar. So Alex, could you please take over and run us through the AI&I talk with Audrey?
Thank you very much, Inga. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually today. We had great physical encounters in Berlin with our AI&I series, and now we just take it digital. I met Audrey last July for an interview that we will be published in our AI&I paper series. It will be out shortly. And it was a pleasure to already get to know this personality that many people in Taiwan, when I posted it in my social media, said, "Oh yeah, we know her, she's great." So I'm happy now to give the floor to Audrey Tang, who will be giving us a 50 minutes sort of keynote, as Taiwan has, for instance, now in the COVID-19 crisis, done a great job due to digital technologies and to an enhanced democracy on the island to help to contain this virus. So I feel there will be lots of learnings for all of us in regard to digital democracy, but also in regard to the current challenge that we face, which is the COVID pandemic. So Audrey, I'm glad to reach you in Taipei, and I'm happy to invite you now to give your keynote speech.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here virtually to speak with both Görlach, who I had a great talk with in the Social Innovation Lab, which is our office. This is literally my office, and so we met there, and everybody gets access to my office. We tore down the walls so everybody can walk in every Wednesday and talk to me for 40 minutes at a time, provided that they agree that the entire transcript is published on the World Web. So if you search for Alex's name and mine, you can see our transcript right there on the internet. This is called Radical Transparency. And indeed, during the COVID outbreak, Taiwan has been doing particularly well because we have a robust civil society that builds upon this idea of radical transparency. Just 16 minutes ago, we had a new announcement from our CECC, our Epidemic Control Center, that we are beginning a mask rationing rule where everybody can get 9 masks, surgical masks, every 14 days, so every 2 weeks. For adults, and for children, it's 10 masks every 2 weeks. And the idea of this mask rationing came first with the pharmacies, and then now with the support of the convenience stores. So the pharmacies, of which there's more than 6,000 institutions, provided all their real-time stock based on the national healthcare card. And the great thing about open data and about co-creation of information is that we can see where the limitations are. For example, this is a real dashboard that is not done by the government, but rather a independent civil society programmer just look at all the pharmacies' data on the mask rationing device of people collecting in the pharmacies, and they calculated automatically, updated every 3 minutes, where are the availabilities, where are the requirements, where the requirements are above the supply, where it is under the supply, and things like that. And this gives a evidence-based policy making, not just for the people in the cabinet, but also for everybody to see for themselves. And so we can see exactly where the problems are. We can see where there are queuing lines. There's even interactive maps, such as this guide that aligns the opening hours of the pharmacies, and so that you can compare it with your working hours. And now with the new system, that is the what we call eMask 2.0, everybody can pre-order for the next week to collect, so that if you pre-order by this week, you can collect again 9 masks next week from any of the 4 convenience stores. And they are very collaborative because we co-designed the system again with the private sector, so that you can collect without any queuing at all. And there's more than 11,000 convenience stores. And I personally tested it myself. This is, again, a very simple idea where a minister overseeing the technical side of these things need to do what we call end-to-end testing. So whenever there is a new feature, for example, the collection from the machine on the convenience store, the collection from the app, the idea that you can swipe in your national health card and automatically pre-order for the next week and so on, I always test it by myself and field any questions on Twitter and things like that. Of course, it's a team effort for both the 1.0 and 2.0 systems. And I hope this very brief overview can let you see the idea in Taiwan is not about the government doing everything. Rather, this is what we call a data collaborative, where everybody, including the private sector, which is for profit but with purpose, and the social sector, which is for purpose but with profit, they can work together and to deliver a data service platform where everybody can see what's really going on using ledger technology and so on. And the government's role is just to support instead of going controlling the data governance. So all the dashboards, all the innovations, all the novel distribution mechanisms and things like that are in fact collaboratively imagined by the civil society through the office hours and through the what we call the social innovation tours, which we have been doing for 3 years. And I tour around Taiwan, going to each and every county, rural areas, indigenous lands, offshore islands, and everywhere in Taiwan, because we have broadband as a human right. Even on the top of the Yushan mountain, the Savia, the name of the indigenous of the mountain, you still have 10 megabits per second unlimited bandwidth and 4G connection for just 15 euros per month. And given this, we can take my mobile office anywhere, my mobile office hour. And every time there is a press conference from the Central Epidemic Command, there's people translating to the Taiwanese sign language. And if people in the indigenous area want to raise their concerns, there's also this kind of remote conferencing where we can offer interpretations from all the 20 different national languages, including indigenous ones. And again, all the section chiefs or higher of the 12 ministries involved in social innovation, they gather in the Social Innovation Lab in Taipei, but they see through this kind of co-presencing, just like the technology we're using, what people around Taiwan have in their ideas. And this ensures a responsive, inclusive, and representative decision making. So this is just an overview, but in conclusion, I would like to show a prayer that is my job description. Because 4 years ago, when I first did digital minister, there was no digital minister before me. It is a new role. So the HR people asked me, what are you going to work on? I try to explain the idea of social innovation and such, and the global goals, building a shared understanding across sectors, and say that my job is on 1718, 1717, and 1706. But 4 years ago, the HR people told me that nobody memorizes the SDGs in their head, so it doesn't work if I just talk about those numbers. So I had to translate that to plain language. So I translate these goals into plain language, and that is literally my job description. It goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Audrey. That's been a fantastic and brief introduction into what you've been doing in Taiwan and with Taiwan. So if somebody were watching us now and saying, okay, this worked on this island, 23 million people, but how do we start all this? Like, what would be your advice to, let's say, the Germans, the French, the English, whoever, like bigger countries, where to start to become digital as you are in Taiwan?
I think at the beginning, in Taiwan, if you ask any random person in Taiwan in 2013, do you think that cross-sectoral collaboration is possible? Do you think that it's possible for a minister to work in cross-ministerial issues and listening to people in a way of office hour in a radically open way? If you ask people whether it's possible to get a rough consensus for each socially divisive topic and so on, people would probably say you're crazy. So it's not like we've had a very long time of doing digital democracy in Taiwan. Everybody is just inventing it as we go. And it all starts around the Occupy of the Parliament around March 2014. Because at the time, people occupied the Parliament in a demonstration. It's not demonstration in the sense of protest, but in the sense of a demo. People see for the first time that with 500,000 people on the street and many more online, it is actually possible to get people into a sense of polity and rough consensus and the 4 demands, not one less, that eventually got accepted by the head of the parliament. So it is an exercise in legitimacy. Now, I'm not saying that you should occupy your parliament, but something equivalent is happening. It is the COVID outbreak. With the COVID outbreak, people start to mobilize everything that they can against a common enemy, that is the spread of the virus. And in this moment of mobilization, everybody who previously had different ideas of how the society should move, at least now have one common understanding. That is to say, we should flatten the curve. We should reduce the R0 of this pandemic. And so the initial part, the most difficult part of settling on a shared value is automatically solved now, given the COVID outbreak. And what is left then is to make sure that people, again, can see what everybody else is doing, can open up the innovation in a way that is not constrained by patents or by trademarks or things like that, in a way of open innovation, and to build effective partnerships. And so a dashboard, just like what I just showed, that shows what's going on, is obviously the first step. And then allowing the people in all the different sectors to produce open innovations that then swiftly gets adopted by the public sector is another very good step.
And is that like also the key component to bridge concerns people may have in regard to the fabric of our democracies and the data collection that is necessary to do all that you just described? Because that's already like on the table, the discussion to avoid another pandemic, to collect citizens' data and such. So is that like, would you say that what you developed in Taiwan here is the platform that can mitigate this?
Yes. So again, if we take the mask map, which is there's a website for it, you can see that none of the applications are done by the public sector. All the pharmacy maps, all the analysis, even the voice assistants, there's more than 100 applications. So I just showed you one, which is the last one. That's the mask map, the analysis. But there's also one for procuring mask, and this one actually, the the author offered it to the Korean government. So people in Korea are now also using the same and looking at the pharmacies, their opening hours, navigating to them, and so on. So if the government controls both the collection and the application, then of course there will be a lot of doubt of, for example, whether the government over-concentrating the powers. But if the government focus only on collection and then immediately publishing, even without any person looking at those numbers, it's published upon collection, then everybody can, through distributed ledgers and other technologies, to ensure that these numbers are legitimate and people can verify it. You can walk to a pharmacy, swipe your national health card to get masks, and then after a few minutes, refresh this map and see the stock level decrease.
Yeah, I wonder how after the crisis, if people will be like continue to see the advantage of the technologies or the applications that you just laid out. I wonder actually if, like, what do you think now in this crisis, we may be like deploying new social habits, new habits altogether. Will that change our conduct also digitally, our conduct as citizens, and what can we do to hinder that?
Mm-hmm. Right. If, for example, washing your hands, right? This used to be a social innovation. Washing your hands was not something that everybody understood as a good thing to do a few hundred years ago. But somehow it became a habit, and it's done not by a top-down emergency order or things like that. It's by people who actually wash their hands properly, teaching the young children how to wash their hands, and so on. And the same goes for the use of masks. So in Taiwan, as we said, we rationed the surgical masks so that everybody gets 9 masks every 2 weeks. So that means you still have 5 days if you go out every day. That if you use this daily in a disposable way, then there will be 5 days without surgical mask. But now we see that there is a need to build social distancing, so that if you enter into a room and you don't have a proper distance with people, then it's always good to protect other people from you to wear a mask, whether you're showing the symptom or not. So there is the need of reusing the mask. So in Taiwan, we have the thing called rice cooker. Electric cooking device. And so our FDA, Food and Drug Administration, actually published a guide of you putting those masks into the rice cooker, and you can, without adding any water, and then you cook it for 8 minutes so that it just clears away any possible virus through the heat, and then it could be reused once. And so I just actually filmed such a rice cooker mask reuse device. So I make sure that even if we're now video conferencing, I don't have to put on a mask to show this surgical mask all the time. And this is, again, a way to build a social habit without a top-down enforcement. In Taiwan currently, there is no penalty associated with not keeping the social distance. But because people know social distance is important, just like washing their hands, they remind other people concurrently without relying on penalty.
And I guess that's also one in hindsight going to be very interesting to look at the learning on how to educate the public quickly on a new emerging crisis. I feel that's also what we have seen now in the pandemic, if it's in Taiwan or America or Germany. But like from the micro level that you just described from Taiwan, like briefly to the macro. And I also want to say to the community that is joining us, you can ask questions in our social media channels, and we will be coming to them shortly. So from the micro to the macro level, like we talk now about Taiwan, but like, as we know, a pandemic, and we see now, is globally. So how do we organize and orchestrate the data flow in regard to help each other out here?
Yes. So, and this is a critical question. First of all, I think the scientific community is truly global, and Taiwan has worked with the entire scientific community, our experts, also through video conferencing, have shared what we have shared. There's a lot of bilateral conversations, and we make sure that anyone who want to use this kind of civil society-powered, a social sector-led innovation instead of a entirely authoritarian top-down way can get access, for example, by scheduling a video conference with me. It's very easy actually for us, and I'm happy to work with you continuously. But more seriously, the scientific data, the papers and things like that, they of course all circulate around the preprint servers, around the journals and things like that. So I think one particular thing Taiwan can help is to share the tool that we translate these scientific ideas into what people can readily understand. For example, I'm showing on my slide now the spokesdog of the Ministry of Health and Welfare. So whenever the Ministry of Health and Welfare says something, for example, what I just talked about, 9 masks every 14 days for adults and 10 for children, and children can buy adults masks, adults can buy children's masks as well. And this is a new change. And as soon as the Ministry of Health and Welfare, our central epidemic commander, talks about it, the spokesdog talks about it again, and in a way that even children can very easily understand, because you see adults are the dog with the eyeglass and children are without the eyeglass and things like that. And the civil society have developed a tool called Dr. Message that can very easily then send this message across, even for the ideas that are usually very difficult to get to. For example, this is, again, it is in the shape of the dog. It is for the line, which is like WhatsApp, a end-to-end encrypted system. And previously, it's very difficult to get people in the end-to-end encrypted system to get the latest clarifications and the spokesdog messages. But through Dr. Message, anyone who invites, this is from a leading antivirus company called Trend Micro, the Trend Micro dog into your chat room, it will scan each incoming message and see whether it contains outdated or disinformation about pretty much everything, but especially about COVID. And it can detect even for image-based outdated or disinformation. And you can also forward to the bot by forwarding it any disinformation or messages. And then it will just very quickly, after seeing a disinformation, warn you about it, and then share with you a humorous message like the spokesdog message that contains the clarified information. So this tool is also something we're happy to share with other people. For example, the cofact.org started as a civil society tool called CoFacts. But if you take away the as and go to cofact.org, you see the Thai version, because it's all open source, free of any copyright restrictions or patent restrictions, that any civil society can just repurpose these tools that then will increase the dissemination of clarification messages. And this is what we call humor over rumor.
I have a question from the community from a user called EuroCloud. Audrey, how would you translate digital sovereignty into key actions?
So digital sovereignty to me means a social sector idea. It's like cooperatives. Before the invention of co-ops and labor unions, it used to be that people think that the employers, the capitalists, and workers are in a zero-sum game. But after the invention of unions and co-ops, suddenly people see that there is an alternative where people can form mutuals or other credit unions or things like that, and collectively decide for themselves how their work need to be done without any fixed relationship. And that put a pressure to the capitalistic system so that they have to work and negotiate with labor unions and so on. So something very similar is happening to data. So when I hear sovereignty, I hear a data collaborative or a data coalition. And a particularly easy way to form it in Taiwan is through voluntary data collaboratives. So what I'm showing here is the Airbox. It is people in primary schools, the teachers using a very cheap, less than 100 euros device to teach about data stewardship. so that people in the primary school can participate in measuring the air quality, in this case, the PM 2.5 level around their school. And when there's more than 2,000 spots measuring, it creates a legitimacy threat to the Minister of Environment, because the Minister of Environment at that time, 5 years ago, only had less than 100 stations. And of course, you're going to trust your neighboring primary schools numbers instead of the 80 or so measuring devices, which is very far from you. And so they negotiated then with the public sector. And because Taiwan has Asia's most free civil society, the journalists' words, the teachers' words is as good as the minister's word. So we cannot beat them. We must join them. So around 4 years ago, we negotiated with the Airbox community, and they say they will allow the environment minister to inspect and calibrate their devices. But in return, they want us to join their distributed ledger and fill in the gaps. And the gaps are industrial parks, industrial areas that are private property, and they cannot just go in and install those airboxes. But it turns out that the municipality owned the lamp in those industrial parks and areas. So we agreed to put their microsensor design and hang this on the lamp within the industrial parks, and so that everybody benefits. So it's a classic way of class based negotiation in both the idea of the teaching of the class and also the citizens themselves being citizen scientists, and they do a negotiation en masse with the public sector, gaining the legitimacy that puts the pressure to the private sector, and then they will then automatically determine the APIs using the social sector API for the private sector to agree to join. And that is, again, also education for global citizenship, because this is open source. Anybody have a Raspberry Pi or a Arduino or things like that can download the code from the Airbox project and run it locally. It is also used for water quality, pollution management, and things like that. So anything that uses this kind of data collection and broad negotiation, I think is a good way to make sure that social sector controls the sovereignty of the data governance system.
In mind that you just showed from improving public health in Taiwan by engaging citizens and especially the youngest in schools to already like sharpen their mind what it means to be active in a digital democracy, going like, let's say, imagine like in Germany after the pandemic, we will be discussing whether or not citizens collect data through apps or another device like a bracelet or through their cell phones, and then they share these kind of data. We already have a discussion if this is like propagated by the executive branch, or if the parliament has the last and ultimate saying. How would you help us with your, like, from one democracy to another? How would you say, okay, Germans, like, you have to start it this or that way, because we have so many interest groups and legitimate claims in that game, but we also have a clear task to avoid the pandemic for the next time.
Indeed. Well, in Taiwan, truth to be told, we did not have this mobilization capability when SARS outbreak happened. So a lot of this discussion and the legal framework was established in a kind of recap after SARS, so that we have the legal required regulations and tools to ensure that we can mobilize as we did this time. So I think I'm sharing with you one of the tools done by the civil society. It's called the COVID-19 location history tool. It's developed in Taiwan, but it's used also in Korea and also in Israel. And the basic idea, very simply put, is that your mobile phone's historical location data, as well as the Google Map data, if you turn on history location feature, Google also have access to where you have been and things like that. This is a simple tool that allows you to download such data from the Google servers, as well as from any compatible API servers, and it compares you with one of the digital trails of the published data from one of the cases. And in Taiwan, we only publish such data from the Central Epidemic Control Center if that they do not know for sure how the overlap works. So it's not like we publish every cases trail data, but in Korea and Israel, there's occasional publications as well. And as long as they're in a common format, people can own their own data. They don't have to provide their digital trail or the location trail to any third party, not even to the government. This is mostly about a single client-side tool that enables them to download all the data sources and do their own comparison and draw their own conclusions without forcibly sharing any data to any other citizen. This is just one example, but it shows the philosophy upon which we're working on these tools.
To your educational example again, like the school example, is that something that in Taiwan is rolled out broadly in schools as like you have digital education? Because like frankly, in many parts of the world now, there's professors teaching for the first time online classes. There's for the first time high school and middle school teachers in America that teach and give homework through digital means. And frankly, because we have been admitting strength and also weaknesses and where we're from, like also Europe is at least partly having a hard time, some parts of the continent, to adopt these e-learning measures. So how did you deploy that in your education system in total?
Yes, well, we fortunately had 10 years of alternative education enabled by a law, so that people who drop out of junior high school like me can still get education resources from the alternative schools, and their rights as teenagers is exactly the same as the same aged people in the schools. So up to 10% of Taiwanese students can be enrolled in the experimental education. And part of the experimental education is what we call the idea of problem-based learning, of learning to solve your local problems by engaging with the community. And these are very popular as alternative schools. And after 10 years of experiments, as of last year, we adopted formally the idea of autonomy, of interaction, of achieving the common good into the core curriculum of basic education. So in a sense, we merged the fork from the alternative schools into the education system so that our teachers no longer hold the standardized answers. And this rollout is not complete. It currently is only doing so in the first grade, in the 7th grade, and the 10th grade. It would take 6 years in total to roll out this new curriculum where each school is free to decide how to engage with their local community as long as they work with the competencies framework that enable the competencies of autonomy, interaction, and the common good. And so digital media literacy was the old moniker, the old brand. Nowadays, we're calling it the digital and media competency, meaning that every curriculum designs with the idea that the children are YouTubers, they are producers, they're programmers, they are basically creators, because literacy sounds like consuming the information, but competency is about creating and remixing the information. And so I would say that most of the schools in the 1st grade and 7th are ready, and the 2nd and 8th grade and above are now looking at how the new curriculum is being taught so they can prepare themselves for the next year. Yeah.
Wow, cool. I have another question from the community, from Wolfgang Schechinger. Audrey, what would you suggest Germans to be more open to tracking apps? Why are people in Taiwan accepting tracking so easily and straightforwardly?
So we're not actually convincing people to accept tracking, quote unquote. What we are doing is for people who are under quarantine to make sure that they are being informed of the fact that there is a digital fence of the place where they're under quarantine. And if they go out of the fence, then, well, they're not supposed to because they're under quarantine. And so they will be contacted immediately. So this is not so much as a convincing, but rather this is just informing that because of the SARS pandemic, there is a law that authorizes the use of such what we call out of collected purpose information, because the telecom providers collect the whereabouts of your phone from the base stations for improving the service. Certainly, it's not to build a digital fence. But after SARS, there's a legal requirement to do so. And the Constitutional Court says that even by physically constraining the person's movement, that is still constitutional. But the digital fence is definitely better than physically constraining, because it's mostly alert, a warning system. It's not barricading people, right? And so it is, if the physical constraint is constitutional, then certainly is the digital fence. And it only applies to the people under quarantine and not any ordinary citizen. For any ordinary citizen, we're just providing this tool and the data for them to download and check for themselves. But certainly they're not being tracked by the for major telecoms in a way that enables this kind of digital fence. So it's a very clear legal and constitutionally ruled precedents happening. I guess it really takes one pandemic. It's like inoculation. You get into this mobilization habit if you have previous exposure to SARS.
That's also like in terms of form. But now in terms of content and how because you mentioned like the decision making that politics and policies do on the grounds of the data collected, like let's say the spread of the virus in China is different than in Italy, is different than in the United States. So how can we make sure that like that this data collection and let's say the algorithms that run through this data in order to give us like the best solution work accurately across like these spaces, the whole planet basically? How can we ensure
right. Yeah, so this is a great question, but unfortunately, I do not have a perfect answer, because in an ideal world, of course, everybody will be using the same, like this Stop COVID tool developed by the COFOR Japan people in Tokyo. And this is a pretty good visualization tool that is multilingual. I contributed to the proofreading of the translation of the Taiwan version, the Mandarin version, but you can also see it in English. So if you want to see it in Deutsch, you can very easily contribute a translation by clicking this OctoCat icon, which represents GitHub. But the point here is that it could be freely reused. The GitHub source repository is for everybody to use. So the civil society in Taiwan also use it to present the spreading and so on in Taiwan. And people in various different municipalities and so on, they can all just look at these development tools and then start their own version for their municipality. And as you can see, there's now more than 1,000 version, 1.4 thousand version around on the GitHub collaborative platform alone. And so in the ideal world, everything will be presented in this way. But at the moment, only people who voluntarily use this open source tool can meaningfully share data and compare orange to oranges in this way. And I guess all we can do is to promote the use of these tools and making sure that people are aware that there are legitimate open source and open data alternatives to the existing proprietary tools, so that the proprietary vendors will then build applications based on those shared data instead of reinventing the whole stack by themselves. It's an ongoing progress, it's an ongoing struggle.
I have another question from the community. Radical transparency, in parentheses, as it has been appearing in your keynote. How has the government adopting this set of principles? Did it lead to any societal changes? Is the question of Julian Kowalczuk.
Yes. So radical transparency means transparency at the root. It doesn't mean that we literally live stream every meeting, because live streaming every meeting is logistically, it privileges people holding the camera. So if you don't want to privilege the person holding the camera, you have to set up 360 camera everywhere. And that is not practical. So what we have done instead is that we share the transcript by default, and it's a full transcript by default. So so we can very easily see, for example, this is in Mandarin and this is in English. On 2019, July 17th, there was a visitor to the Social Innovation Lab, and each and every word that we ever uttered during those conversations. But the idea is that you can quote each quote. It has its own URL. You can do full text search and analysis, and it's all in structured data. If you add a .an to it, it's actually in XML that you can very easily process and so on. So the whole point of radical transparency is to make sure that it takes extra effort to be non-open. If during this conversation, the visitor tells an anecdotal story about one of their friends who have not cleared for radical transparency, then the visitor can edit it within the next 10 days to redact that part or to anonymize that part, but it takes effort. So the end result is that by default, everything is open, but for things that like trade secrets and private information and things like that, there's always a chance to remedy it. And so that also makes it much more possible for the public service to accept it because it reduces their risk overall.
In the home stretch of our great conversation, let's look ahead and the future, what the future may hold. And the user DDD Chap asked, how will the coronavirus influence the technology industry? For example, how will it accelerate VE and AR technology?
Yeah, and I think just like we had this meeting platform where we can very easily run a local GC server, and this technology has been around for years. But nowadays, people suddenly start to see, oh, actually, this is better than we imagined, better than we remembered. Because people who don't do video conferencing all the time, they sometimes remember video conferencing like 5 years ago or 8 years ago, where the latency is very high, where people become pixelated, and actually you cannot read people's expressions. But nowadays, with video conferencing being very easily accessible, everybody just opens a browser and can get into a video conferencing, unless you want to do a slideshow in the same time, of which we spent 10 minutes calibrating. But if you're just wanting to meet people face to face, then it's actually very easy. You don't have to install anything. So I think the outbreak is one of the greatest opportunity for people to experience what the modern technology really is like, instead of what they remember 10 years ago. Is a good way to clear people's cache in their brain, so that they understand that it is now very accessible, and certainly we can see each other much more easily and in finer expression compared to if we meet face to face and I have to wear a mask.
Yeah, understand. In the end, I used my role to ask you a question that is in my head. Since we talked last in July, I was talked to a lot of people working in the industry when it comes to biases, and they say like there seems to be like a consensus carving itself out, saying like there's so many biases, and they are like legally, and you were mentioning the law and the lawfulness of actions also in the digital realm before, that we cannot like tune out all biases that may be like differently perceived in each another country. But what we can do is we look into the constitutions, and they all have the same things that it's forbidden to discriminate against: gender, race, sexual orientation, age, disabilities, and all that. Is that something where you see the industry in fact going as like creating the sort of consensus? We don't want to have biases in our products. It's not accountable and not reliable. And we look into constitutional values, or have just spoken to a few people who share this opinion, but it's not an overall trend? What's your observation?
Well, in Taiwan, for example, if you're entering quarantine because you just visited Taiwan from overseas, you will see this self-health declaration either from an app or in paper form if you don't want to touch a touch screen for some reason. But for example, the gender field, there is an other field which I consistently use. And that is one way to kind of coexist with existing systems, but allowing a way for people to say, I don't want to be discriminated by gender, by essentially opting out of the binary gender system. And of course, once we have people doing that consistently, it builds a social norm so that, for example, the new set of emoji from the leading private sector companies, they no longer default to men or to boy as they used to default to, but rather default to a gender neutral form and only have, so basically it's radical post-gender because it's post-gender by default, and it takes you extra effort to switch to the male or feminine forms in an emoji. So from the emoji, we can see that there really is a norm that is currently going on, at least for gender-based things. People start to think about, why do we need to train our AIs to read genders for our customers and things like that? Because unless we're selling gender-specific products, it is actually noise. It is actually not signal and things like that. Of course, discrimination is not just by gender. Ethnicity, especially skin color and things like that, it is also a large factor. So many people think that facial recognition should just be, heavily restricted, so that, for example, in Taiwan, we only use it for the e-gate, which is a government opt-in system where you can have your face instead of having a person looking at your passport when you're going out of the gate of the airport, to have instead a machine read it. But it's an opt-in, and it's by default cannot scan any other person, and it only compares to your passport data anyway. And so it's considered okay. But otherwise, there is a large social norm that says facial recognition is not okay for purposes where there's a conceivable alternative, like biomotion sensor or things like that.
Thank you very much. That was a very insightful and inspiring conversation. And just the last remark reminded me that I was about to come to Taiwan next week, but due to the global pandemic, we may be seeing each other hopefully in the fall again.
Yes, and I'm scheduled actually to be in Berlin today. I guess I'm sort of also, but I look forward also to meet you face-to-face in the fall.
Yeah, thank you. And I miss Taiwan, so have a good day, Zaichen, and 谢谢.
谢谢, and stay safe, and have a good local time.